moving on to our third presenter. Jan Purnis is an associate professor in the Department of English at Campion College. Her research interests include representations of digestion, the mind-body relationship, religious discussion of the resurrection of the body, and the cannibalism motif. She has published material on the role of the stomach in early modern theories of emotion and gender, the belly-mind relationship, and Renaissance out-of-body experiences. Her work on cannibalism received an Insight Development Grant from SCÉR.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jan Pernis. I'm in the English department at Campion College at the University of Regina. My talk today is entitled Colonialist Ideology and Renaissance Psychophysiology. The Renaissance was a period of rapid expansion of the English language. As Maurizio Gatti observes, there was a great need for, quote, the new terms to enable English writers to carry out the translation of foreign texts and cope with the rapid development in the various branches of knowledge, unquote. In The Art of English Poesy, published in 1589, George Putnam remarks that many so-called inkhorn terms, scholarly or bookish terms introduced from other languages, as well as many strange terms of other languages, are brought in by secretaries, merchants, and travelers. He notes that while it would be hard to spare words like politician and significative because they aren't easily matched by English words, other borrowed words like audacious and compatible are, he says, not so well to be allowed by us. Given this influx of new words, it's not surprising that the period also witnessed the development and proliferation of dictionaries, which in the 16th century were more like glossaries, as they mostly offered a translation of words from one language into another. The earliest examples were of Latin and then French, Spanish, and Italian. Soon, explanations in English of so-called hard words began to appear. The connection between expanded vocabulary and geographical expansion is highlighted in titles like Florio's A World of Words, 1598, and later Queen Anne's New World of Words, 1611. When, in 1582, Richard Mulcaster called for someone to gather together all of the words used in English and provide not only their proper spelling, but also their proper use, he specifies that he means both natural English words and those that are incorporate. I'm particularly interested in this process of word incorporation, partly because of my broader interest in the digestive organs and their role in the assimilation, not just of ingested food, but also of cultural values and ideology. In what time remains, I want to focus on the incorporation of the word cannibal, a word that entered the English language as a direct result of European colonialism. As Peter Hume observed some years ago, Columbus introduced the word, which was originally the proper name for the indigenous Caribs. But through a highly questionable association between Caribs and the eating of human flesh, it ended up with that association attached to it. One goal of my larger project is to contribute to the problematization of the word by offering a more detailed analysis of its history and to encourage greater mindfulness of its historical context and embedded colonialist ideology, while also thinking about the incorporation of the word cannibal into early modern discussions about the nature of incorporation itself. But I only have time here to offer an appetizer of food for thought, so I focus on two examples, Shakespeare's Othello and early modern editions of Augustine's City of God. When Philip Sidney describes how some authors use words that are so far-fetched that many must seem monsters or strangers to any poor Englishman, he might have had the word cannibal in mind, as it is a word fetched from a geographically distant land, and it describes, in the words of a 1561 explanation, a monstrous kind of people feeding only with man's flesh, lately discovered by Colonus the Spaniard. However, the word is no longer a stranger to any English speaker, and Shakespeare's plays provide some insight into the process of its familiarization. When Othello describes his wooing of Desdemona, He relates how he won her affections with tales of his worldly adventures, saying, "It was my hint to speak, such was my process, and of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagi, and men whose heads grew beneath their shoulders. These things to hear would Desdemona seriously incline, but still the house affairs would draw her hence, whichever as she could with haste dispatch, she'd come again, and with a greedy ear devour up my discourse." Othello introduces two unfamiliar words, cannibals and the Greek word anthropophagi, introduced into English at about the same time through translation of ancient travel accounts of eaters of people. Othello's narrative thus highlights the importance of travelers and translators in the expansion of English vocabulary, as well as the influence of classical travel writing on shaping the expectations of early modern voyagers and their audiences. Because neither term is familiar, Shakespeare has Othello do the work of a dictionary, employing what Robert Watson calls the instant glossary method, a method whereby the meaning of an unfamiliar word is included for audience edification. Othello adds the explanatory phrase that cannibals each other eat, and he gives anthropophagi as basically a synonym, thereby spreading the word cannibal with its people eating meaning attached. As a side note, it is, I think, worth mentioning that although Shakespeare doubles up on proper names when it comes to those who each other eat, he omits the proper name for the men whose heads grow beneath their shoulders, called the Blemians in, for example, Cockram's 1623 English Dictionary. Since Shakespeare refers to these people again in The Tempest, and again describes them without naming them, though he has played around with the word cannibal in naming Caliban, we might speculate on why this might be, whether it's a coincidence or conscious decision, or whether it's suggestive of an interest in the idea but not the word, or whether linked to notions of believability within the New World context. As an additional side note, Shakespeare's explanation that the cannibals and anthropophagi each other eat more resembles descriptions in classical texts of the Essidones, whom Eliot includes in his dictionary, writing that they are a people which do eat their friends when they be dead and drink in the skulls of their heads. But Shakespeare seems more interested in the word cannibal. The unfamiliar words Othello does introduce reach multiple audiences: Desdemona, and then her father and other important Venetian men, as well as the offstage audience, many of whom, Watson suggests, attended plays for the specific purpose of learning new words, expanding their social standing alongside their vocabulary. The description of Desdemona as audience is particularly interesting. Shakespeare highlights the process of the familiarization of the linguistically foreign by stressing that Desdemona goes back and forth between hearing stories about exotic lands and peoples and her household affairs. In this way, Shakespeare gives an explicit example of words crossing thresholds. In his St. Crispin's Day speech, Henry V promises a similar domestication to his followers, in this case linked to fame, when he tells them that their names will become familiar as household words. Desdemona is depicted in the process of carrying new words and their meanings across the threshold and into the interior of the household, just as housewives also played an important role in domesticating foreign products, a process Kim Hall has traced in relation to the increasing use of sugar in the English diet, and thus in the connection between English women and slave labor. In The Art of English Poesy, Putnam similarly links words, commodities, and women when explaining that he has chosen to give the rhetorical figure of metalepsis the English name of the far-fet, because it involves the use of a word from far off, when one closer to hand would do just as well. And he adds that the deviser of the rhetorical device must have had women in mind, since it is also proverbial that things far sought and dear bought are good for ladies. Although Desdemona never uses either of the words introduced by Othello, nor does her waiting woman Amelia, though she does tell her mistress that men eat women hungrily, in Coriolanus, Shakespeare offers an instance of a household serving man using the word cannibally. And the host in Merry Wives of Windsor cries out, anthropophaginian, both apparently coinages that didn't catch on, but which in their modifications nonetheless provide evidence of how foreign words are Englished according to familiar word formation patterns. With these examples, Shakespeare may be offering insight into the role of class in language transformation, just as Desdemona's role offers insight into gender implications. And as a side note here, the word anthropophagi was fully anglicized in the period in the appearance around the turn of around 1600 of the terms man-eater and man-eater. Desdemona's greedy devouring of Othello's discourse highlights not only appetites for romances and tales of adventure, but also long-standing associations between corporeal ingestion, digestion, and assimilation, and between those and the assimilation of language, texts, and knowledge. Philip Sidney, for example, encourages imitators of classical authors to do more than keep books of their figures and phrases, but, quote, as by attentive translation, as it were, to devour them whole and make them wholly theirs, unquote. Furthermore, words could themselves engage in the digestive process. Putnam describes the dropping of a vowel as the swallowing or eating up of one letter by another. I wish to suggest, however, that such metaphors of ingestion and digestion point to the psychophysiological importance of the digestive tract in the interaction between self and society, and to the ways in which ideology and cultural values are internalized and corporealized. Early modern examples of the trope of reading and learning as acts of ingestion and digestion can thus provide useful historical context for recent insightful engagements with modern gut science by scholars like Elizabeth Wilson, who argues in her book, Gut Feminism, for the gut as an organ of mind, or Shannon Sullivan, who explores the physiology of sexist and racist oppression in her book with that title. In the early modern period, words were frequently depicted as substances one ingested and assimilated to various degrees through the digestive tract, and they are frequently depicted as having a very visceral impact on the digestive organs. Words might, for example, stick in one's stomach, an organ that could, in the period, be understood as a locus of mind, as the expression to utter the bottom of one's stomach suggests. I've written about this elsewhere, but I could talk about it in more length in the discussion. 2. For my second main example of word incorporation, I want ever so briefly to offer an example of the assimilation of the word cannibal into discussion about the nature of corporeal incorporation itself and across the margin text border. Many scholars have called attention to the corporeal and geographical connotations of the marginalia text relationship. William Slights, for instance, refers to the geography of the page and the terrain of print, as well as ways of, quote, transversing the text context threshold, unquote. My example of this threshold crossing comes from Renaissance editions of Augustine's City of God. My particular focus is on his discussion of the resurrection of the body. Almost from its inception, the doctrine that at Judgment Day, souls would be rejoined with their bodies faced challenges in the form of concerns about what Carolyn Walker Bynum calls chain consumption and what John Reynolds anachronistically calls the cannibal conundrum. How is resurrection possible if one person's flesh has been ingested, either by animals or, most worryingly, by another person? Is it possible for both eater and eaten to be restored to wholeness? Answers to the question needed to take into account how bodily digestion works, something I don't have time to address in detail here, but would be happy to talk about in the discussion session. Refuting arguments by people like Athenagoras, who claimed that because eating human flesh is unnatural, that flesh would not be assimilated by the eater, but would be excreted and so ready for constitution later, Augustine writes, suppose that someone under compulsion of the last straits of starvation eats human corpses. This terrible thing has happened, as we know from the testimony of ancient history, and even from the unhappy experiences of our own times. Now, surely no one is going to maintain, with any show of truth or reason, that the whole of a body so eaten passes straight through the intestinal tract without any change or conversion into the flesh of the eater. The former emaciation of the eater and subsequent disappearance are sufficient indication that physical deficiency are supplied by such nutriment. Augustine goes on to explain how God will solve the problem, but it's not so relevant here, so I'll just leave that. In 1522, Juan Luis Vives prepared, at the request of Erasmus, an edition of the City of God, which importantly included extensive commentary. Although Erasmus and Vives had a falling out, when Erasmus published Augustine's opera Omnia in the late 1520s, he included Vives' edition, but without commentary. However, in 1531, Vives published the City of God with a different publisher with revised commentary, which, as Enrique Gonzalez remarks, for a century and a half, the corrected and annotated text of Vives was the new Vulgate, since it survived Catholic censorship, save for a few cuts. Together with Augustine's text, Vives' notes passed into many languages and appeared 5 times in French, twice in English, 3 times in Dutch, though with only a selection from the notes as anonymous commentaries. End of Gonzalez. In his commentary on the section of City God that I just quoted from, Vives provides an updated version of Augustine's resurrection scenario. To Augustine's examples of people eating corpses in times of famine and siege, Vives adds, in my translation, that there are also people who are nourished by no other meat, who are thus called anthropophagi. Vives expands the example from local cases of desperation to a people who habitually eat human flesh. The Greek word appears in Greek letters, highlighting its foreignness. The first French translation of Vives' edition of the City of God and his commentary was published in 1570. The translation was by Jean-Etienne Hervé, and the commentary remains fairly similar. In Hervé's French, he explains, in my translation, that there are nations who are nourished by human flesh only, and for this reason they are called anthropophagi, which is, again, continues to appear in Greek, which means eaters of men. What is especially interesting is that the French edition also advertises how it is enriched by many annotations and comments in the margins by François de Belforêt, who draws on his knowledge of ancient and modern history. Although many of the printed marginal notes added by Belforêt simply indicate the content of the main text, in the section I focus on, Belforêt adds a marginal gloss to Vives' reference to anthropophagi, which translates as, which we at present know the cannibals to be. Just as cannibals are frequently depicted at the edges of maps and of humanity, here the word and its embedded colonialist ideology appears in the text margins. There's an additional assimilative move that happens in the first English translation of the City of God and Vives' commentary, which was published in 1610. The translation is attributed to John Healy and appears to have been based on the French edition because the second English edition of 1620 is advertised as having been compared with the Latin original and corrected where necessary. In addition, the French translation is mentioned in the prefatory material to the 1610 edition. Interestingly, the cannibals from Belforêt's marginal gloss here migrate from the margin into Vives' commentary proper, so that the relevant section explaining ancient stories reads, many cities in straight sieges have been driven to this. There's also a people called anthropophagi, or cannibals, that live upon man's flesh. The or, linking cannibals and anthropophagi, resembles the passage in Shakespeare's Othello, as well as other examples appearing in Thomas Browne's Religio Medici, for example, illustrating the association made between the New World people and the practice of consumption of human flesh. It is also worth noting that this wording remains the same in the 1620 edition, even though there is no mention of cannibals in the Latin original, which was apparently consulted for that revised edition. This is one of many examples in the period of the incorporation of capital C cannibals into religious discussion of the resurrection of the body. These examples underscore intersections of this religious discussion about the nature of incorporation and of the self with discourses of colonialism. I suggest distinguishing between what I call pre- and post-Columbian resurrection debate in order to foreground the overlooked significance of the New World to this theological discussion and to the role played by religious writers in contributing to the assimilation of the word cannibal and its colonialist ideology into texts and embodied texts. Thank you.